My name is Rebecca Feuerstein. I work with our adult community at BBYO, our alumni, our parents. Thrilled to see so many of your faces here and hope that your back to school experiences are off to a great start. We're excited to jump into tonight's conversation with a BBG alumna herself, Alyse Levine, who is the founder and CEO of Premium Prep College Counseling. Before I give you a little bit of background on Alyse, just to share how these events came to life at BBYO, I work in partnership with our Parent Advisory Council, and we know that our parents are BBYO's most important partners and the best advocates that we have for our teen community. And the Parent Council serves as a convening body of parents who represent the voices of our families across BBYO communities at large. And they work within our local communities and at the national level to help advance BBYO's effort to develop and strengthen a global community of our parents. We've seen participation scale to the thousands of parents in these monthly virtual programs. Excited to start this year off with an excellent topic around college admissions. I know many of you are eager to jump into that process with your teens, or maybe a bit apprehensive. We're going to address all of that tonight. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to our main speaker. Alyse is one of the foremost college counseling experts in the country and the founder and CEO of Premium Prep. Prior to founding the company, she was the Associate Director of College Counseling at the Dalton School in New York City for over 10 years. She was the Assistant Director of Undergraduate Admissions at the Washington University in St. Louis and the Associate Director of College Counseling at the Dwight Englewood School in Englewood, New Jersey. She was named one of the top 50 women leaders of North Carolina for 2022. And is deeply committed to the Jewish community, both locally and nationally. She's calling in tonight from Chapel Hill, and we are excited to have her join us. Please join me in welcoming Alyse.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. As Rebecca mentioned, I was in BBYO when I was a student and loved that experience. It was a really important part of my development, and I was the president of my BBG chapter in Westchester, where I grew up. Tonight, I'm wearing a little bit of a different hat. I'm here as a member of the BBYO Women's Leadership Initiative. It's an honor to be a part of that group of incredible women. And I am the CEO, as Rebecca said, of Premium Prep College Counseling. In that role, I oversee an incredible team of 25 counselors and 25 writing specialists. And these are some of the most experienced, caring, wonderful counselors in the country. Our philosophy and approach is very much about the match, helping students find the schools that are best for them. That is what is most important in this process. We work with a really diverse population of students all over the country, all over the world. But we do work with a very large population of Jewish students, so have a lot of expertise in the particular interests, needs, and questions that Jewish students and families have. I am accompanied today by my wonderful colleague, friend, and partner. Lisa Frankel is the Executive Vice President of Premium Prep. She is here with me today. She will be moderating this conversation and sprinkling in the many, many questions that you all shared. We have over 300 questions, so we did our best to consolidate them and see where there was the most repetition so we could really address your questions. Lisa brings a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge to this field as well. She worked for 10 years at a Jewish day school in Philadelphia. So it is very appropriate that she is here with us tonight speaking to the BBYO parent community. So thank you, Lisa. Thanks for being here with me tonight, and let's dive in and get started with the first question and the first topic.
Okay. Okay, so so area of interest and major.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start with the topic of area of interest and major because this is actually a topic that we have come to realize is often overlooked, but is extremely important. So many students are undecided, which is 100% okay, but then they can be a little bit haphazard in how they present themselves, checking off potential interests, answering those future plans questions, and not fully recognizing or understanding the impact that that can have on their outcome. So I wanted to share a little bit of data. Data is really important in the world of college admissions. So here is just a sampling of some schools where you can see in orange the overall admit rate, and then underneath some of the more specific admit rates by school, program, or major. So for instance, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the overall admit rate is 44%. The College of Engineering is 22%, so half of that. So significantly more selective. In addition to these STEM majors, psychology has become very popular as well. So you can see at Bucknell, the overall is 29%, and then the admit rate for psychology is half of that, 15%. Business is another area that is very, very popular at many schools. At Boulder, the overall is 80%, and you see that dramatic difference in the admit rate at the Leeds Business School. Michigan, similarly, a very popular school amongst our students and a large Jewish community, overall 18%, the Ross School 9%. And they just changed the way in which they're actually doing admissions this year, making it more possible to apply directly. So it's become an even more nuanced process. When it comes to these STEM majors, students' preparation is critically important. Colleges are really looking for students who have rigorous curriculum in math and science and strong testing in math, potentially science as well, if you've taken the ACT, and also strong grades in those math and science courses. So that is really, really critically important. Some of the majors you're not seeing on here, Lisa, we can pull this slide down for now and just speak, are the humanities and social sciences. Those areas, the arts, the humanities, many of the social sciences are not as popular right now, and therefore many colleges are looking to increase their enrollment in those areas. And so for students who have talents and interests in those areas, it's worth really highlighting that and talking about that. We don't want students to be overly strategic, applying to things they're not actually interested. We want them to be genuine in this process. But again, what we find is that many students come to this process really unsure what they want to study. So we don't want them to inadvertently put themselves into a more competitive major or field without even realizing it. So that was one of the reasons that I chose to kind of start with this topic. Another really important piece of information is to make sure that you learn and understand which schools read by major and which don't. The vast majority do. So it's more the exception than the norm. A handful of schools as examples that don't read by major are Tulane, Richmond, University of North Carolina, just to give you a sampling. But again, that is quite rare. And even within those schools, there tend to be a couple of examples where some of their more saturated, popular majors, they do look more specifically at major. So interestingly, there were no questions on this topic. That didn't surprise us because, again, so many people overlook this as such a critical issue. What was the next topic, Lisa?
Well, we actually do have one question that I think might be helpful just to explain what you
Great.
mean by read by major. I think
Yeah, read by major. So some colleges are actually looking at students' background, credentials, experience as it relates to the major that they have selected on their application. Other schools are looking more broadly at the student, admitting everybody into a general school. Everybody is usually starting liberal arts, or they can start in particular areas, but they don't have different criteria based on what major you are applying into. So that's a great question, and it's a little bit nuanced where you enter from school to school.
Okay. All right, I'm going to pull it back up now.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Jewish identity.
Yeah, so the next topic I, of course, wanted to dive into quickly was the topic of navigating one's Jewish identity. This is obviously something on a lot of students and families' minds. So many of your questions pertain to this. So we're going to do our best to address this as carefully, sensitively, and thoughtfully, and be as helpful as possible. So the first bit of advice I would give, and I really feel comfortable saying this, is embrace your Jewish identity. Colleges are comfortable, and you can feel confident that by and large colleges are not biased against students who are talking about their Jewish identity or perhaps an experience in Israel. There is extensive DEI training that takes place in these admissions offices, and they are really trained to be unbiased and not bring their own politics, religious preferences, backgrounds to the table. If you were to find that there was a school that was discriminating and that was going to be a factor, I'd like to think that that is probably a school you do not want your child going to. That is probably a good signal that that would not be a healthy, safe, comfortable environment for your child. I think what is important when you are disclosing and talking about your Jewish identity is that you also communicate through your application that you're open-minded, that you are eager to meet other people of different backgrounds, people who have different beliefs and experiences, and that you really show that you have that respect and that interest in dialogue. I really believe that college is designed to be a safe place for that kind of discussion and debate. And so most admissions offices feel that way too. And so they want students who bring ideas, perspectives, backgrounds, but who are open to coming to college to learn about people who have different backgrounds, who have different experiences. There were a lot of good questions about the Supreme Court's decision a year ago to end affirmative action. Despite that decision, colleges are still very interested in diversity of all kinds, socioeconomic, religious, ethnic, racial. And so they're looking for ways to bring in a diverse class of students. Any questions about this topic before we move to the next, Lisa?
Yeah, I'm wondering about one good question I think I liked was that should you answer the religion question on applications?
That's a great question. I think, first of all, you don't see that very often anymore. It's pretty unusual, and it is typically obviously optional. I think that's a very personal decision. In my opinion, that is not going to hurt you. So it's perfectly fine to disclose that information. Of course, if you have concerns or are uncomfortable in any way and would rather keep that information private, I think that's also okay. I would say most of our students do answer when prompted, but we have some students who prefer and choose not to.
Okay. Should we move to the next?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right.
Essays. Excellent.
My favorite topic.
Yes, essays are one of our absolute favorite topics. We are very much in the thick of essay work right now with all of our students. Lisa and I both met with students shortly before this meeting. I actually helped a student put the finishing touches on her personal essay today. So that was very, very exciting and monumental. Yeah, so being authentic is really important in college essays. You want your own voice to come across. You also should feel comfortable taking some risks. It is okay to kind of put yourself out there. Again, as long as you're doing this in a way that is showing respect of other opinions, if you're kind of taking a stand on something or talking about something that's a bit controversial, as long as that nuance is really coming across. One thing you'll hear about a lot today is that colleges care about and are assessing students' character. In the last 5 to 10 years, that's become a much more integral part of the college process. It is not just about how strong a student you are, how intellectual you are. It is also how good of a person you are, how you treat your fellow neighbor. That's obviously really a tenet of our Jewish values. And that is something that colleges care about. And it's important that your values, your character, comes across in your essays. So let's dive into the specifics of writing about a Jewish topic, and is that okay? So of course, in my opinion, that is very much okay. And we have many students who do choose to talk about a topic that is related to their Jewish identity or background. I thought it might be helpful to give a few examples of recent successful essays. One student talked beautifully about his conflicted identity with being Orthodox, and really grappling with that, but did it in a way that showed such respect for his Orthodox Jewish day school. It was very nuanced and very thoughtful. Another student spoke about the tallis bag that her grandmother had crocheted for her and many other members of her family, and how this spoke to her identity, her heritage. So it really focused on this object, but then that became the thread throughout the essay, and all the details about the tallis bag were quite beautiful. Another student talked about being the bugler at her Jewish camp and what an honor it was to take on that leadership role. There was a little humor in there about being the bugler, but it was just a really touching, powerful coming of age story. Another student talked about fighting against anti-Semitism, working as an intern in an organization called Rise Against Hate. Some of you might be familiar with that organization in New Jersey. Another example was actually a supplemental essay where the student applying to NYU talked about having come from a very kind of homogeneous Jewish community, her hunger for diversity, her desire to go somewhere where she would meet students of many, many different backgrounds. And I think that really speaks to a lot of the essay questions we're seeing now, a proliferation of questions in the supplements about identity, about who you are, your role in the community. Duke this year had 5 optional questions. They're encouraging you to do 2 of the 5. The last one is about how are you different? One student tackled a question like that last year by talking about advocating with her family to be evaluated for autism. It was a feeling she had. Her family was uneasy about it, and how they ultimately allowed her to do that, and how liberating it was for her to understand herself better. So there are just a really wide variety of ways that students talk about identity, but certainly being a member of a Jewish community, being a minority, is an appropriate way to go about that, and not something a student should feel like they need to shy away from. The last topic I wanted to talk about with essays for a moment was ChatGPT. ChatGPT is something that is a wonderful tool. I'm sure many of us have played around with it or used it in the workplace, but it can really be a bit of a trap. It just doesn't write great college essays. We had a senior admissions counselor last spring, speak to us from GW. She showed us samples of AI generated versus student written essays. And it was just so obvious to all of us. For those of you who listen to podcasts, I think it was The Daily, I was listening to one this week or last week, and Curtis Sittenfeld, one of my favorite authors, took on a contest at the New York Times. So she was given certain prompts to write a short story. They put the same prompts into ChatGPT, and I loved that the interviewer said, not only was Curtis Sittenfeld's story so much better, but it had a soul. And I think that is very much what matters in college essays. I see my colleague Lisa shaking her head. Soulless essays are not going to help. And so ChatGPT is a helpful tool, certainly for certain writing assignments or brainstorming, but I would not rely on it for your college essay. I also think it does cross some ethical boundaries, but different colleges have different statements about how you should or shouldn't use it. The last thing I wanted to say is that you don't have to write about a topic for your main personal essay that is all wrapped up in identity or some of these more challenging topics. Like, we have students go to the opposite end of the spectrum and write powerful essays about banal topics. One of my favorites, it was a former student of Lisa's, wrote about her dislike of the avocado, and it was very powerful. Another student recently wrote about her mom online dating and how uncomfortable and cringy that was for her. And then ultimately ended by saying that her mom met someone and how comforting that was for her, the student, that when she left home, her mom had a companion and wasn't lonely, which was very beautiful. We have a couple students writing about chickens. There's always funny topics that come up. So it doesn't have to be something deeply serious if that's just not who you are and the direction you want to go in. Any other essay questions or things you want to add, Lisa?
Yeah, I want to chime in there just a bit. It's my favorite. This is my favorite aspect of the process. And I think I love essays that are unexpected and that show a really interesting and profound insight into a student that you wouldn't have, that surprises you. I'm thinking of the avocado essay. The reason it worked so well is because it wasn't actually about avocados. It was about the fact that she wasn't a fixed and static entity, that she could change. And it was an embrace that she was always thought she was someone who didn't like avocados, or that she did, but then she admitted that, and she's like, but I can still be me. And it was more about her and her identity. And I'm thinking of someone in one of our staff meetings recently told us about an essay. It was about a kid who has chronic lateness, and he was late getting home, and he got in trouble for it. But the reason he was late is because he actually stopped to help someone clean the window up their car. And he made a conscious decision, being like, I'm going to be late, I'm going to get in trouble, but I'm going to feel better about myself as a human being if I actually help this person with their car. And so he's like, I decided to take the hit. I love that type of essay. So I like those. I wanted to just add.
I love that.
Questions that we had. Should students complete the optional essay if it's optional?
So if there are 4 optional questions, which Colgate has been doing for many years, I always say do 2 of them. Common sense. Don't do none of them. Don't feel like you have to do all of them. Show the effort. Don't be lazy. There are other optional questions that are truly optional. The additional information section is a 650-word open text box. You do not have to write anything there. Most of our students put nothing there, and that is 100% fine. So there is nuance around what is optional and what is not optional. I think if you have nothing to say and you are trying to answer an optional question and it's contrived, then you're better off not answering it. So don't feel pressured to answer a question. There was a question one year, may have been Duke, about kind of like an LGBTQ very specific question. Well, that does not pertain to everyone. And so it would be odd to feel like you have to answer that if you don't have something genuine to say.
Should we move on?
Please.
All right, on to activities.
Yeah, so I actually added this topic yesterday morning when I was looking through all of the questions that people posed. There were just so many good questions about activities. And when it comes to the type of activities, there's no right or wrong. This is different from our generation, where there was sort of more of an expectation that you do certain types of things. Everybody should play a sport and everybody should do an art. That's not the case anymore. Colleges actually care very little about what you do. It's more about the depth and the commitment that you make to the things that you're involved in. Similarly, there was a question about how many activities. So quality is much more important than quantity. Truth be told, the activity chart on the main Common App that most students use has 10 lines, 10 options. You don't need to fill all 10 out. Some students do, some students don't. If you have 3 or 4 activities, but there is great depth to them, that is totally not just okay, but excellent. What we typically advise is casting a bit of a wider net in 9th grade, getting involved in a lot of things, trying things out, experimenting, and then beginning to narrow that, but deepen and focus based on what you are genuinely interested in. Having said that, some students are just, they love to be involved. That was me. I was that kind of student. I was involved in such a wide range of activities. I was the classic well-rounded student, and that's okay. For other students, they really do gravitate towards 2 or 3 activities, themes, things that they're really excited about and interested in. I think it is, I'll be honest again, in this day and age, a little easier to stand out, particularly in competitive admissions pools, when you are that more angular or pointy student, as opposed to the generally well-rounded student. But we have seen great success with both types. And I think, again, a lot of this is sort of how you present yourself and making sure that your genuine interest in the things you're involved in is there. The 4th, leadership and character. Character, again, I've talked about that already multiple times. Leadership still matters. That is something that colleges are looking for. It does not have to be leadership in the traditional sense of captain of a team, president of the student body, editor of the newspaper. It can be something in which you are showing leadership by taking great initiative with a volunteer position, with a job. It does not have to be the traditional forms of leadership. I wanted to give a few examples of some students that we've worked with recently and how they have really shown that depth to their interests. One student loves languages. She takes 2 languages in school. She became interested in Native American languages and that they were actually dying, these spoken languages. And she began to learn a little bit about the indigenous languages of the area that she lived in, and actually started to study and learn one of the languages. And that was just so unusual and unique, but again, very genuine in terms of her learning about Native American history, language, culture. Another student, this is going back a few years, it was COVID. His parents were very strict. He barely left the house. He discovered just a deep love for music. He never played an instrument. He never sang. Finally, the world started opening up again, and we were trying to find ways for him to get involved. He ended up doing an internship at the Performing Arts Series at UNC Chapel Hill. And there was like an artist in residence there doing a project involving a translation of letters from slaves. And this really allowed him to get deeply enmeshed in the project, to really get to know the artist. It ended up being an integral part of his main personal essay, and his continued love and interest in music really showed throughout the rest of his application. Another student had worked for years in a local after-school program in a neighboring community for underprivileged kids. She had a deep love for science. She noticed that the Latino girls in that program were really not seeing science as something that was for girls. And so she developed a new program teaching these girls science through hands-on experiments. It reminded me a lot of those like science-themed birthday parties that some of our kids used to have. But it was really rewarding for her to see some of these girls get very excited. So those are just a few examples of the types of ways that students have dug deeper into some of their interests. Any questions, Lisa?
Well, we got quite a few, but I think that one that came up that I feel like is helpful is what do you mean by activities? Like what constitutes an activity? What counts?
That's a great question. So activities have a much broader definition than they did when we were coming of age. Jobs, home responsibilities, people who help take care of grandparents, younger siblings. It can be volunteer experiences, summer experiences, school-based activities, certainly youth group, things like BBYO. I think BBYO, other youth groups are great ways for students to show their commitment, their involvement in a community, leadership, programming. So it is so wide ranging. I don't even think I covered all the possible ways in which activities are defined.
I had a kid once start a chess camp in his backyard for all of the kids in his neighborhood, and it was fantastically successful. He literally taught this whole group of kids chess. It was wonderful. So one of the other questions was, should you include your BBYO activities on in your list and on your resume for college application?
That's right. That's right. I meant to talk about that. Absolutely. I think if that is something that you are genuinely involved in and committed to, and it's an important part of your the way you spend your time, I think that that is very valuable and appropriate to include. I think it's when you get to filler, some students are like, should I put the French club? I think I went to one meeting. You know, those things are not as meaningful. You do write how many hours per week, how many weeks per year. But certainly if your child is deeply involved in their BBYO chapter, perhaps regional, perhaps national, whatever it is, I do think that that can be a very important part of a student's activities and very appropriate. And we often have students talk about their youth group involvement in their activities.
Okay, should we move on?
Yes, please.
All right. Next up, letters of recommendation.
Excellent. So this is another one that there were no questions on, and that's part of why I want to talk about it. I think letters of recommendation often are far more important than people realize. And I think that it's valuable for students and families to be aware of how you can play a role in making these letters outstanding. It is so important, particularly if you go to a larger school or a public school, which is where my children grew up and went, and it was a wonderful school. It is so important that the student take it upon themselves to really make sure that their counselor has the information they need to write the best letter possible. So some high schools call them brag sheets, some have questionnaires, some have nothing, and it really, the onus is on the student to just meet with the counselor. If they can't meet with the counselor, to put information in writing about themselves. We have lots of tools to help students put that kind of information together in a meaningful way. But as we know in our country, there are not enough counselors to really serve the students in a lot of these schools. They often have very large caseloads and are juggling a lot of balls. And so they don't always know the student very well. And so those letters can fall flat. And so the more you can do to make sure that the counselor has the information they need, the better. Supplemental recommendations. If you are very involved in whether it's BBYO or you have a job or any activity, maybe it's a school sport, maybe it's the advisor to one of your clubs, if there is someone in your community who really does know you very well and can talk about you in a different way than your teachers and your counselor, I am an advocate for supplemental recommendations. Not for everyone. There is a common theory that less is more in this process. But if there is someone that is going to be able to really speak on your behalf in a meaningful way, I think that letter can be worth including. One caveat is that colleges will vary on how many outside letters, they call them other recommenders, they will allow. And that will vary from 0 to 3, but most allow at least 1. And we almost always recommend only 1 supplemental letter, not more. That can be overkill. You are asking someone to read more than what is required, and so you don't want to burden them with too much additional information.
And just to clarify, so most private schools are going to ask for 2 letters of recommendation from your teachers, typically from your core classes like math, history, science, language, English, and then the counselor letter, and that's by default. So most you're going to get one counselor letter from your college counselor, your guidance counselor, your dean, or whoever, and then 2 teachers, ideally from junior year. But since the pandemic, it's okay to have a sophomore year teacher if it's the best bet. And then so the supplemental recommenders are not within, they're not one of your teachers. Typically, it could be a coach, it could be a boss, it could be someone that from the school community that's the head of one of your activities that you're really involved in, that type of thing. There's a little confusion.
Yeah. And even if you know your teacher and your teacher knows you better than your counselor, it still behooves the student to highlight what surprised you that you learned in that class. What did you love about that class?
Mhm.
What was an assignment or a unit that you really enjoyed? It's just hard for teachers to keep track of all that from one year to the next. So it's really valuable for students to make that extra effort to help their teachers. Many teachers will have a questionnaire where they ask students to fill out certain information. Take that seriously, put the time in. If they don't have a questionnaire, think about what are the things that I would want them to be able to talk about, and let me put some of that information in writing for them to make their lives easier.
I think this is also related to what Alyse had been saying earlier about character, right? And that colleges are looking to see evidence of good character. And what do we mean by that? Oftentimes it's oftentimes it's impact on the community. Like, are you doing something that's creating a better environment for the people around you? And one of the best places to kind of find that is in a letter of recommendation. So especially when you're thinking of who might be a potential supplemental recommender that we should consider, who's seen your child in that sort of light, who's seen them do something that's community building, or that's expanding other students' awareness, or that's giving back in a way, or that's creating an opportunity for other people. Like that's a great person to ask to or to consider asking.
I couldn't resist. I saw the summer camp question pop up because I only see the beginning of the words in the chat, or I'm too distracted.
Yeah,
Yeah, Lisa and I debated the summer camp.
we bring up summer camp.
Yeah, we'll bring up summer camp.
Yeah.
So, okay, camp is a tricky one. And again, I have promised candor in this presentation because I think that's so important. So I think camp, and one of my own children went to camp. I went to camp. I'm a huge advocate for camp. I have nothing against camp. But mostly students of privilege get to go to camp. Camp is usually quite expensive. And so it does, I think, colleges are aware of that. And so it is something that you need to be able to talk about in a way that shows some sensitivity, perhaps, to that factor, or shows a connection to your larger interests. Some of my favorite camp essays have worked beautifully because they've been students who love children, become counselors, want to work as either teachers or community leaders or running organizations like BBYO for young people. And so it connects to their larger interests. I did mention the student who was the bugler because I do think camp can be a great essay, but it does have some risks because of that privilege factor. There are so many activities out there, summer programs, not just camp, that are what we call pay to play. And it's not that they're bad. Some of those are incredibly valuable experiences, but colleges are aware of who has access to some of those activities. So what we are always trying to encourage students to do is think about ways that they can do things that are a little bit more homegrown as they progress through the years of high school. Most students are home and doing something a little bit more local that summer between junior and senior year, stepping away from camp a little bit. Many don't, especially because of COVID. Some kids, they missed a year, and so they're going a little bit longer. So we navigate camp all the time, and we would never want to tell a student to stop going to camp when it is the thing that they love more than anything in life. But it is one of those topics that can be a little bit of a double-edged sword.
Right. Right.
Yeah, move on.
Supplemental.
Yeah, so after talking about supplemental recommendations, it felt important to also talk a little bit about supplemental information, because this is, again, I think, one of those little spoken about areas that can have a lot of impact. First of all, this is something that most students don't do and don't need to do. But there are occasions where supplemental information can be helpful and appropriate. These are the three main areas. The first is an art portfolio. Even if the student is not applying into a theater program, a music program, an art program, many schools will accept a portfolio. They sometimes give specifications. Sometimes it's requested through a program called Slide Room. Other times the student is just sending samples of their work on their own little Instagram site, or they've made a little website. But that information can help paint a larger picture of a student's talents. Independent study, if a student has done an independent study or has done independent research, providing some kind of a summary of that can be quite valuable, because very often there is not a specific place to put that on an application. That usually would be a good topic to talk about in that additional information section that I mentioned earlier. The third is if a student has some kind of a web presence. One student had a pretty successful baking business. She baked lots of very customized cakes for mostly children's birthday parties. And so the photos were really incredible. Another student was pretty prolific as a writer in local papers and his school paper, so wanted to be able to show a sampling of his writing. Other students have done some cool graphic design work. So for students who have some kind of a web presence, that can be a helpful supplemental piece. Most colleges read through Slate. That is a CRM, and they typically cannot click on a link. So links, if they are sent, should be sent either in the application portal or in a follow-up email to an admissions counselor. So that's just a little pro tip that popped into the brain.
Can you explain what you mean? I think you mean admissions portal, because that just what you mean by that. Yeah.
So once a student applies to college, they are sent information for how to create an individual application portal or admissions portal at that college. And that's where they will know what information has arrived that they've sent, what's missing. If there's new information that they need to update the college, sometimes colleges allow students to send updated scores, or if there's been a change of course or some kind of unusual circumstance that's affected the student, that is the way in which you would be communicating and sending information to the college, and the way that the college is communicating with you. It is also ultimately where the college will tell the student their admissions outcome, their decision.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on.
Next up are early.
Okay. Can you take the slide down for a minute while I introduce the topic? Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. So early, I wanted to talk a little bit about the different rounds of applications. There's regular decision, which is quite straightforward. There's early decision, where you apply early and you are making a binding agreement, and you hear early, a binding commitment. And then there's early action, which is where you apply early, you hear early, but you are not bound. You do not have to go to the school. So early decision can be a big advantage. Many schools do admit about 3 times higher admit rate in early decision than regular. So it can be quite tempting. We can go ahead and share the slide now, Lisa. So that is something that families need to consider very seriously. It is very important that the student has done their research, that they feel absolutely certain this is their top choice. And it's also a family decision because of the financial commitment. There are ways to break that early decision commitment should there be financial evidence that the family truly cannot afford it. But many students and families are uneasy because of the financial commitment, and that is okay. This is not for everyone. I'd say on the flip side of the advantages, there is also the risk of getting caught up in how perhaps there's an advantage, so students overreach. And then that can have sort of that domino effect on the rest of the regular outcomes. Whereas if they had applied to what we like to call a realistic reach or an in-range reach, they would have really optimized their chances and had a higher likelihood of being admitted. So you want to be smart and thoughtful about where you apply early decision. Early action, the non-binding, there's very few disadvantages. You almost always want to meet an early action deadline. The admit rate is higher, almost always. There are a couple exceptions, Georgetown being the most common. And it very often these schools fill the vast majority of their enrollment in that early action pool. That's quite common. Places like Maryland, the vast majority of students apply early and they take most of their students in that early round. So it's virtually impossible to be admitted in the regular decision round. So there's almost always an advantage to meeting any kind of priority or early action deadline.
And so that counts for rolling schools. Rolling schools we basically consider them as early action, even if they don't say it or call it as such.
Yeah, so for schools that are rolling, it's really important to apply. Typically, we say by mid-September, if at all possible, places like Pitt, because schools in the UK are rolling, because they begin to fill up and it becomes more selective as we move forward. So rolling is similar, like Lisa said, we treat it like a priority deadline, but almost to an even further extent. You want to make sure that you are getting that application out as early as possible. Yeah, are there other questions, Lisa?
No, I'm just realizing rolling admission means that they're admitting students on a rolling basis. That means that the longer you wait, the fewer spots remain versus like if there's a regular or early decision process where they're admitting an entire cohort on a given date. That's what the difference there. There was a question which I think is worth looking at, ED1 versus ED2, differences, advantages, disadvantages.
Yeah, so most of what you're looking at here are combined ED1 and ED2 for places that have that, and many of these do, like Emory and Tulane. So it's combined. We usually see a higher admit rate in ED1, where they have wide open, no spaces filled yet. And then things often get a little bit more competitive in ED2. There are some schools that use ED2 more so for athletes. They might be focusing on recruitment, but we see some schools where it's quite similar, ED1 versus ED2. So I'd say for students who want to go for a place that's a bigger reach, ED1, and then maybe somewhere else a little bit more in range reach, ED2, that is not a bad approach at all. We often call that parallel planning. So they're kind of ready to go right before winter break. If they have to submit that ED2 application or ask the college to switch them very often from RD or EA to the ED2 option. So still a big advantage, but sometimes not quite as big an advantage in ED2 as ED1.
Right, and the deadlines later. So ED1 deadlines happen first, that's November 1st, along with a lot of early action deadlines. ED2 deadlines tend to fall January 1st, about the same time as regular decision deadlines, but the ED2 round actually starts around December 15th, when all of the ED1 schools release their decisions. And for students that don't get the news they were hoping for, they might then consider applying somewhere ED2 before the January deadline. But ED2 is just as binding as ED1. So approach that with a lot of consideration. I think that's...
Yeah, we can move on to the next one. Yeah,
okay.
Start the next slide. Thank you.
Testing.
So testing is never the most interesting of topics, but yet one that there are so many questions about. And since COVID, it's just a much more complicated part of the process because there's so many different options. I'm going to talk about the good news and the not so good news. So let's start with the good news. The good news is since COVID, when schools were really forced to go test optional everywhere, many schools have decided they like test optional and they have remained test optional. So the vast majority of colleges, over 2,000, are test optional, meaning it is completely up to you if you do or don't want to send your scores. And the vast majority of those schools really are not showing any preference towards students who do or don't send test scores. There's evidence that they admit as many students who do send scores as they admit students who don't send scores, or there are lots and lots of schools, like endless schools, that admit more students who didn't send scores because the majority who applied didn't to that school. The bad news is that there are some schools, and they tend to be the more selective ones, that do either enroll or admit a higher percentage of students who have submitted scores. So we see that at places like Emory and Duke and Penn, and a variety, Amherst, of other places. So it's important to be aware of that, to make sure you're looking at that data, to speak to an expert if you're confused about how to get that. It can require some digging to really understand what their attitude is. The other piece that has evolved in the last couple of years since the pandemic has subsided is that many schools have moved back to reinstating the test scores. And so we're now seeing about 120 schools that are indeed requiring test scores. So some of the first we saw were the entire Florida public system, the Georgia public system, and then we started to see some private schools. Many at first were places like MIT and then Caltech that are really looking at STEM kids, where they felt that math preparation was so critically important. But now we are seeing many others like Yale and Harvard, and yet there are some who are in yet another gray area. So we have this test recommended category where they're test optional, but their language does convey that they're planning to move back to requiring testing in a year, and they really would prefer, if you have scores, that you send them this year. So Johns Hopkins, Rice, Cornell. Cornell is a complicated one right now. They still have half their schools are test optional and half are test free. So more good news, there are a lot of schools that are test free. The entire California public university system, lots of fabulous liberal arts colleges like Pitzer and Reed, and test free, or you can also use the term test blind, means that they literally will not accept or consider test scores whatsoever. A question that I saw multiple times was, how do you know whether you should or shouldn't send your scores if it's test optional and you have scores? So the most basic advice that I can give is to make sure you look at the middle 50% test scores of enrolled students and see how your score compares. If it's above that, send it. If it's below that middle 50%, don't send it. And if it's in the mid 50% range, that's really a judgment call and looking at the rest of the factors and other parts of your application. That is the general advice. Obviously, this is a very personal process and there are a lot of other factors to consider, but in a big webinar like this, I did want to share how we typically advise students. The last thing I'll say about testing is that this spring, a new ACT is being rolled out. It is shorter, similar to the new SAT that was rolled out last year. So that's the really good news. Again, a bit of bad news is that colleges have not really said if this new optional science section is something they're going to require, not require. Colleges are feeling as blindsided by this announcement of a change as anyone. And so we're really waiting for that news. For any student who is kind of unsure, I would say sign up to take the science just in case, especially if your interests are in some way connected to a science field. Any questions about testing?
I want to chime in on one thing. Just I know that some schools, even if they're test optional, actually prefer to see testing in STEM, specifically engineering, hard sciences, sometimes business. Though the colleges will be honest about that. We like to see testing for those particular majors. Some of the questions, SAT versus ACT, is there an advantage to one versus another, or should you ever send both?
There is no advantage to one versus the other. Colleges are open to either, show no preferential treatment whatsoever. That does not matter. Occasionally there's a reason to send both. If there's some lopsidedness in the scores, that can be a reason to send both to demonstrate, okay, I did really well in the verbal area on this test, but better on the math and science on the ACT. So typically not. You want to look in the concordance charts and send whichever is your best score between the ACT and the SAT, but there are occasional exceptions where we would recommend both. Next topic.
Next topic. Goodbye testing. Yes. Jewish resources.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I wanted to end by doing a deep dive and talk about what is going on college campuses and how to do your absolute best to be informed about anti-Semitism and Jewish safety. This is obviously a critically important issue for all students and parents. I have 2 children in college. I understand this on a personal level, a professional level. We navigate this with families all the time. The best thing to do is to speak to current students, to visit these colleges, to meet with and spend time at Hillel's and Chabad's to really learn about these communities. It is also incredibly important to stay vigilant in reading what is in the news, what is in the media. I would encourage you to subscribe to the Chronicle of Higher Ed or Inside Higher Ed so that you are not just reading what's in mainstream media, but really what is focused on what is happening in higher education. There are articles literally every day on this topic about different campuses and issues going on. Just this week alone, an article was about a Brown trustee that resigned because of the upcoming vote on divestment. Penn announced this week they are creating a new center for Title VI, which prohibits discrimination based on race, based on religion, anti-Semitism. WashU and their student newspapers are great. I highly encourage you to subscribe online. It's all online now to student newspapers. I have a child there, so that was an obvious one for me to subscribe to, and I'm an alum. But there was a recent panel discussion, and the chancellor was on the discussion, on the panel, excuse me, on free speech, and talked about how there is no place for hate speech on their campus. But really, like any research project that you really want to get the facts on, this has to be a multi-prong approach. You cannot just rely on any one source.
Yeah.
By the way, we will be sending a follow-up link in the next few days with all of the links to everything that has been a link in this slideshow. So I know there are no links here because it's hard to click on a slide link, but we will be, that email is ready to go. Hillel, obviously you are all familiar. It has wonderful profiles about colleges. You can compare colleges, a tracker for anti-Semitism, and their latest site is called Campus for All, which has tons of resources on anti-Semitism and college climate. The ADL report card is a very valuable tool. The AMCHA initiative does a wonderful job of tracking incidents on different college campuses, so you can search by campus. Jewish on Campus is a student-led organization about empowering Jewish students through grassroots organizing. Report Campus Hate is a repository that collects incidents of anti-Semitism. Chabad, of course, has really grown. There are so many more Chabad centers on or near college campuses. Tribe Talk is an incredible resource about religious life, social life, kosher food, everything you could imagine. I do recommend subscribing to some of the social media pages. I think there were some specific questions. I follow them. Obviously, it's social media. You need to take it with a grain of salt and do your own research, but it is helpful. There's MOT, Members of the Tribe, and MACA, Mothers Against Colleges with Anti-Semitism. I love the Brandeis Mandel Center. I attend a ton of their events and read their newsletter, and the Jewish National Fund. I know we're running out of time, so any questions on that one before we get to the last slide, Lisa?
Okay. No, I think we're good. Ready?
Okay.
Oh.
Ooh, okay, thank you. I wanted to provide some specific resources about scholarships for Jewish students. I know that that's a question that many families have. We will provide more links and information on that follow-up, but here are some of the key ones where we've seen lots of students have success. So I wanted to highlight those, but won't go into detail in the spirit of time. Any final questions, Lisa, before we wrap up?
You've had so many questions in the chat. It's a shame that we can't answer all of them.
Maybe
But
move to that last slide as we answer one or two, just so people can see how to reach us.
definitely, definitely. I think a great one is like, how do you get involved in campus as a Jewish student when you're new to campus? Like, what are some tips or advice?
Yeah. Hillel and Chabad are amazing. I mean, they have Friday night services, bagel brunches, philanthropy events. I mean, it is just incredible what kind of outreach they do. Make sure you're on their mailing list. They all have direct mailing list emails. So you can refresh that last slide.
Yeah.
So that is really the best way to get involved in the Jewish community right away. I find the directors of the Hillel, the rabbis, are very accessible. And then the other one is, if you're interested in Greek life, is to begin reaching out to those Jewish organizations right away, which can be wonderful communities for Jewish students as well.
And like websites like Tribe Talk that have like college profiles that they'll detail if there are Jewish fraternities and sororities, or what student groups there are on campus, and those are great resources for learning about all of that. So, and one thing I will say, Shabbat dinners tend to be very popular because there's food, so that tends to get a big turnout from both Jewish and non-Jewish students alike.
Yes, free food and often more home cooked food
Yes.
than you will get from the dining services. Yes, excellent. Yeah. Rebecca, thank you so much for having us. I know you wanted to say a few closing remarks. It's been wonderful to be here with you all tonight, and please don't hesitate to be in touch if we can help and answer any other questions.
Well, thank you so much, Alyse and Lisa, for your generous insights and support for the BBYO community and speaking with everyone tonight. We know there is so much nuance in college admissions, and really appreciate the strategies that you provided. We know there was a lot of questions we didn't get to in the chat. Your team has said that you will very generously support with answers in our follow-up communication. So know if you submitted a question tonight, along with the resources that they named in their presentation and with the recording, we'll also do our best to get back to those questions. So thank you all for your thoughtfulness tonight. If you want to follow up with Alyse and her team, you can visit, hopefully you caught the QR, if not, their website, premiumprep.com. We'll include that in our follow-up as well. I know many of you asked about BBYO and how to include that as a part of your students' admission. BBYO CEO Matt Grossman also sends a letter to over 120 college admissions officers every year, and you can learn more about that on our website. He actually hasn't yet updated this year. He updates that every October, so I'm going to put the link in the chat for last year's letter if you want to take a look, and you can learn more about the schools that's submitted to, or if there's a particular school you want him to send a letter to, we're happy to accommodate that as well. The next event for the entire BBYO community is October 6th at 2 p.m. We're going to be discussing October 7th, 1 year later, as we approach the 1 year mark to the tragic events that took place in Israel. On October 7th, we invite you to join us as we remember and honor and call for action through music and Jewish wisdom and testimonies of our teens, our alumni, and survivors. So we want to thank you again for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us again in the future, and look forward to sharing more programs with the parent community soon. So please be on the lookout for the recording of tonight's session in your inboxes in the coming days. Thank you again, and have a great night.
Bye.